all is well. Our next topic in this unit is called exponential growth, and we're going to talk about graphing exponential growth. So y equals 2 to the x would be an example of exponential growth. The reason we call it exponential is because our x, or the variable, is in the exponent. The reason we call it growth is because as we graph this, as we go from left to right, the y values are going to increase, and you'll see that in a sec. So just like any graph, if we want to see kind of what it's doing, we can always plot points. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to pick 0 for x, and then calculate what our y value would be. We're going to get to this part in a little bit, but right now we're calculating values for y equals 2 to the x. So if we plug in 2 for x, 2 to the 0, well, we know anything to the 0 power is just 1. So 0, 1 would be 1 point. So we can plot that. Oops, sorry, 0, 1 should be here. Okay, so let's keep going. I'm going to put 1 for x. So 2 to the 1. So 2 times itself just one time would just be 2. So 1, 2. If I plug in 2 for x, 2 to the 2 is just 4. So 2, 4. It's another point. Let's do one more in that direction, so I'll go off the table. 2 to the 3rd would be 8. So if I plug in 3 for x, 2 to the 3rd, I get 8. So 3, 8. So that would be up here. Now let's pick some negative values. So it's important to remember what happens and what we do with negative exponents. So if I plug in -1 for x, so I'll come off here. So 2 to the -1. Remember, that's just 1 over 2 to the +1. So 1 over 2. So I get 1/2 when I plug in -1. So let's plot that. -1, 1/2 would be here, about. And then if I plug in -2, so 2 to the -2, I get 1 over 2 to the +2, or 1/4. So -2 gives me 1/4. So -2, 1/4. So your graph is going to start to look something like this. And it's going to continue with the arrows to go in those directions. Now, obviously, if we plotted more points, you would get an even better idea of what the graph's doing. So what I wanted to do with this, which is also exponential growth, the only difference is I have a 3 out in front. So if we have a number out in front that's greater than 1, we're going to call that a vertical stretch. So it's going to stretch compared to this graph without the 3 out in front. And we'll see that in a sec. So here is the y equals 2 to the x graph. If we were to continue to plot points, it would look like this. But we got the general shape plotting points. So now this graph, the y equals 3 times 2 to the x, again, the 3 is going to what we call stretch the y equals 2 to the x graph. So from the red, which is y equals 2 to the x, to the purple, which is y equals 3 times 2 to the x, we call this a stretch. So if I put a 2 out in front, it stretches it a little bit less than if I put the 3. If I put the 4, 5, so on. So these are all stretches of the original y equals 2 to the x. So to recap, this is just a Introduction to Graphing Exponential Growth. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the difference between exponential growth and then exponential decay. Right? We're also going to talk about what happens if I throw a negative number out in front of the y equals 2 to the x.